you want to be in touch with them, they're not plant people, but they might know some of the names of the plants. I
So
don't know if that's
I've gone
helpful.
through many of the Ho-Chunk names with Sheila Shigley, who's been their language person.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm Kelly Kindscher, and we're at the Wapello Reserve, and I'm an ethnobotanist from the University of Kansas, and here to talk about edible and medicinal plants. For the Omaha, they would view this plant as a male buffalo bellow plant. I'm sorry, this is the female buffalo bellow plant, because it would flower when the buffaloes were bellowing, and the lead plant was the male buffalo bellow plant. So I'm at this. They recognize male and female forms of plants, like echinaceas. There were of one echinacea species, they'd recognize both the male and female form, and occasionally they attribute male and female characteristics to multiple species or combine them. So their taxonomy is paralleled ours, but also had differences, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. I've written about edible and medicinal plants, and I'm working on an edition of both books, but right now I'm focused on the edible plants book. Originally I had 120 some species of native prairie plants and a broad definition of prairie plants, including pigweeds, amaranths, annual sunflower, and then the other end, woody things, plums, chokecherries, all of those are prairie plants. We don't have real big needs on food if you think about it, and variety of food's important to us. We have actually bigger health needs. I mean, I don't know, I haven't quite done this, but if you could go to, let's say, your large super grocery store that has the pharmacy section, are there more things in the pharmacy in terms of medicines behind the counter, in front of the counter, than there are in the food section of your store?
Well, in particular, the produce section. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure, there's more.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Also, I can say on my edible plant book, I tried everything pretty religiously. Medicinal plants, I couldn't do that, right? I mean, there's a lot of plants for, giving birth or menstruation or just think of all the sicknesses and diseases we have that, are fairly unique, or even things we don't understand, and native folks had a different conception of medicine anyhow. So there were a lot of plants used for a whole variety of things, and that explains part of it. And then one other thing is efficacy. I'll talk more about this tonight, but I've done a lot of research, and almost all of the medicinal plants have active compounds. I mean, they have compounds in them that our human bodies respond to. So for the most part, almost entirely, they just didn't like, oh, here's plants, just grab them. And another example of that is grasses, for the most part, don't have secondary compounds. They don't have medicinal compounds. Grasses evolved with grazers. They want to be eaten, paradoxically, right? They want to be grazed and resprout. Other plants really don't want to be eaten, and most other plants or forbs have flowering parts on top, so they don't want the tops to be eaten. So they create compounds. So grasses have very few compounds. Very, very few grasses are used as medicine. Just disproportionately low if you just did a random search of plants. So native folks had much more evolved taxonomy. Lakotas had 4 species to our 1 species. Pawnee had 2. And they divided them up on smells and tastes, which really makes sense. Classic, of course, botany today is all based on reproduction and genetics, right? Theirs were based really much more on uses. Unusual plant, right? Carrot family? Anybody see any carrot parts in something like this?
Oh, interesting.
I mean, a little bit of an umbel, maybe, but
Sort of.
but not very. This plant's fascinating in that it has a fiber plant. So the scientific name is Orangium yuccifolium,
Right.
and the leaves, basal leaves, are pretty tough and very stringy, and there's fibers in those strings. Probably the oldest use of prairie plant that we can find is sandals made with fibers of rattlesnake master that are, I believe, 6,000 years old. Again,
Wow.
found in caves. We have, in the Ozarks, we have problems here that, preservation's pretty tough, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I know there's even been some archaeological work done here, but if you can imagine if there was, a pair of sandals that someone left, yeah, they're completely gone. And also other places that are disturbed, let's say creek edges, not edges, but like open creek, you know, floodplain or river floodplains, or land disturbance, you get more of the annual sunflowers. But the seeds are all edible. They're just tiny, hard to process. But they were processed, and it's another one that you would pound. Pound the whole seed and shell and boil it and skim off the nice oil off the top and use that for flavor, seasoning, and you know, oils are great.
Yeah, right.
Right? So we don't think about all of our sunflowers as food. And then of course there's great debate on the origin of our cultivated sunflowers. We now know archaeologically the oldest archaeological remains that are found of sunflowers are like 4,000-year-old seeds that were associated with food in Mexico. But the northern plains has seeds that go back almost 2,000 years. And there's some belief that those may be separate, maybe independent origins of these seeds. The Auricera, who I've had some opportunity to work with, when a woman was interviewed who was in her 80s in the 1920s, so she went back to 1860s, talking about their traditional ways. They cultivated sunflowers, and the sunflower seeds were big like ours today, but she said we also harvest the wild ones. And someone said, well, why'd you harvest the wild ones? And she said, well, they taste better. More flavor in them. Makes me think about wild strawberries, right? Just that sometimes the small wild things just have a lot more flavor. And of course, most of our agricultural practices, including native practices, select for yield. I mean, that's appealing. And of course, we do appreciate that thinking about something like corn, it's this huge thing today in terms of grain size and cob size that Native Americans mostly developed. The grain size has not increased that much in the last 20, 50 years. It's pretty much Native folks did that. Now there's other, of course, traits being added. But how could that selection have happened from, you know, we're just now figuring out the wild type, but the wild types don't look anything like corn. They're like just a grass with these little tiny heads with, you know, 10, 15 kernels kind of stacked. So it's an amazing selection process that went on. And we do know in this region that there are cultivars of ragweeds that were selected for, lamb's quarters that were selected for, sumpweed, Iva innua, a smartweed that was selected for, that we call semi-cultivated, and at least in some cases, believe it or not, the large-seeded tall ragweed is extinct. So there was selection for a larger seeded ragweed that's only in the archaeological record. And with lamb's quarters, there's archaeological seeds that have thinner coats that would be better cooked than our wild ones. So we see even signs of domestication. Used medicinal plant. And it was a cure-all. Used for all sorts of things. Snake bite, which I mentioned, fevers, colds, used topically more than internally. Fresh plant material ground up and for wounds, for things that need to heal, internally, externally, just used extensively. What we now know it has lots of immune stimulant power. It has an immune stimulating compound in the carbohydrates, especially the carbohydrates. If you take the plant material and remove all the carbohydrate from the plant material, there's another, at least one more immune stimulating compound. So it has more than one compound that stimulates the immune system, which what that does is the immune system's what gets your white blood cells going after bad guys and grabbing them. I'll mention this more specifically tonight because there's even good published literature on this, but there's clinical trials that show that you're less likely to get flu, colds, but upper respiratory tract infections by consuming this. The best studies I like is one for people flying to and from Australia. You know, when you're on a plane, right? Yeah. The guy next to you is hacking away, because we're more conscious of that now with COVID. You know, you're likely to get something. But if you consume echinacea tincture that's made before, during, and after that flight, your chances of getting upper respiratory tract infection is significantly less and the duration is significantly less.
Wow.
So it's a pretty powerful plant root. I've done a lot of work on this plant, and I did write a book about echinacea. But the other part I got involved in was conservation. So echinacea that's used is either cultivated purpurea, echinacea purpurea, which probably would be the one you grow in your garden, although echinacea pallida is wonderful, and I basically growing it. But most of the plant material that's used is either purpurea or angustifolia. And angustifolia is out in the high plains, and it is abundant in places, but there was concern about overuse. And I did a calculation once. I mean, there have been millions of plants dug up. So you start thinking about those numbers, and it's of concern. So we got involved in work looking at that, and it's an amazing plant. If you dig the top 6 to 8 inches of the plant, half of them will resprout. It's an amazing plant. I mean, it's even tougher than dandelions. Dandelions will resprout, but if you dig down 6 to 8 inches, you're going to get your dandelion. But they resprout. And this pallida does too. Then some plants, again, go back to your favorite prairie plants, many of us like Baptisia, this big wild white indigo. Slightly poisonous. It's got rotenone in it. Anybody know what rotenone?
Whoa.
Sure.
Yeah. Several plants. Lead plant has some too. But pretty small amounts. Rotenone is one of the leading fish poisons. If you live on a farm and have a farm pond and it's full of goldfish or something, they'll give you rotenone, which is coming from a tropical bean family plant, and it will kill all the fish.
Really?
Yeah, pretty effective. So there's small amounts of that in this, so I wouldn't recommend eating it, but it's also bitter, not taste very good. But the plant is a dye plant. I mean, in fact, you can even tell that by, it's a weak substitute for a blue dye.
Oh.
And the plant turns this kind of bluish black. As it dries down, the pods turn black. So you can see it has these compounds in it. I've been working with someone who's an artist that teaches at the KU Art School, and just really experimenting with all these dyes from plants. It is so easy to get color out of our prairie plants. The harder thing is to get it to be fixed, stay in the fabric. And then there's so much in terms of mordants and changing the colors based on how you prepare the plant, the process you use in extracting the dye. It's just wild. I mean, it's a fun thing to look at, and one of the people is dyeing some really just wonderful silk scarves with, yellows and greens are easy. Historically too, reds and purples are very hard. And you think about it, what are royal colors? Those are the valuable dye plant, valuable colors.
Spiderwort, when it's blooming, has such a deep purple. I don't know if it stays, but it certainly stains your clothes.
That's
and your
right.
hands.
That's right. Yeah. So many of these plants provide color, but then getting them fixed in the cloth or clothing is the hard part. Anyone here eating milkweed?
No, never.
Yeah. What parts you eat?
A little dry. The pods of them, I've had them fried and pickled.
Pickled?
Pickled.
I've done the pickle one. You got one on me there. So this one of my, I guess I would say favorite, but one of my more favorite spring foods. Young milkweed shoots when they're only that tall.
Oh yeah.
The first leaves coming out. Recommend you boil them, drain it, boil them again. One of the sweetest vegetables I know.
Really? Sweetest.
And the use of milkweed greens, but more likely, more often still, young pods. So pods as they're developing, and flowers, flower buds in particular, flower buds and young pods are still extremely popular soup for Winnebago in Nebraska, Potawatomi in Kansas, Omaha, Nebraska, and I'm sure other tribes, but still being used by those tribes as a cultural food item. And of course, I talked to some of them and said, I cook these and drain them, and don't bother with that. So I assume the young, very young the flower buds and the pods probably have so little of the latex, and then within the latex are cardiac glycosides, heart glycosides, which are not good for your heart, actually. Cardenolides are the compounds. I've had great opportunity to work with medicinal chemists. We've just in the last 10 years, we studied this plant and other milkweeds and extracted new compounds. Chemistry work is like so many things now. The technical abilities are so great that pretty much any plant that has like a published record of compounds, folks can come in today and find new stuff. You know, we can detect parts per trillion. The chemistry techniques in the lab are astounding. And this, you know, the computer-aided techniques and such. So we're discovering new compounds in this. But, you know, there's other uses here too. Even the fluff, anybody know about this? Hypoallergenic pillows are made out of milkweed fluff.
Really?
Yeah, you can buy them on the web even if you look for it. They just take off the seeds, and the fluff was used extensively in World War II for a substitute for, I think, kapok, but a tropical fluffy material for life preservers. Then it kind of went by the wayside, and of course we have, you know, all sorts of synthetic pillow stuff now, and yet there's been a renaissance, and then people are allergic to a lot of those compounds, so I've not really slept with a milkweed pillow. I guess I should buy one and try it. Long history of Navy folks and us today, soaking the berries maybe overnight with no heat. The seeds are full of tannins, and the plant's full of tannins, but the covering has that lemonade taste. Unique, nice, kind of fun. Great thing for kids too. Yeah. One other use of it, I like dogwood better as a chew stick. I saw some dogwood back, but this is used as a chew stick. Clean your teeth. What I don't like is more bitter, but essentially, and what I like about the dogwood, I just saw some back there, is it's got a little straighter fiber, but you get as small a stem as you can, and just chew on it and turn it into a toothbrush.
Really?
And then
so the fibers expand a little bit.
Yeah, they do, and then you can massage your gums and reach back there. And I found personally that I keep one in my car. I don't show anyone, but I keep one in my car, and I'll just start chewing on it and then rubbing my teeth around it.
I wanted to thank our sponsors, and I'm going to start with the Apple River State Bank, First Community Bank of Galena. They have been sponsoring our educational activities like this for the last 4 years, and so we're grateful for their sponsorship of our education and outreach program, and so we want to thank them. Is anyone here from Apple River State Bank? Let's give them an applause. I also want to thank our friends of Wapello, and if you are or have been involved with the volunteer group of Friends of Wapello, this group has been caring for the Wapello Land and Water Reserve just down the road here for the last 13 years. And they're out there every week, every Tuesday morning, caring for the prairie, keeping the trails clear so that others can enjoy that beautiful preserve along the Apple River. And last, I want to thank River Lights Bookstore in Dubuque. And Dina Kurt is here. She's one of the managers at the bookstore. And she is selling one of Dr. Kindscher's books, The Edible Plants of the Prairie. And I just had Kelly sign one for my daughter, so he's signing those books. And we'll do that after. Some of you have already purchased a book, but that will be open after the presentation as well. He's the author of 3 books. We mentioned the one, Edible Wild Plants of the Prairie in 1987, The Medicinal Wild Plants of the Prairie in 1992, published by University Press of Kansas, and most recently, Echinacea, Herbal Medicine with a Wild History in 2016. He's also, and we'll talk about this, working on a new edition of one of his books. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Kindscher.
My interest in plants goes back to growing up on a homestead farm in Nebraska, where I learned plants from my father and Spent a lot of time in nature and grew up in Kansas and at the University of Kansas and realized I was adept at learning about plants and kind of delved into that and then had this passion which many of us have today of like foraging and learning about wild plants and wild foods and medicines and realized there was kind of a need for more information on that. And well, there was a lot of information on the native people who, of course, are not directly around or we don't see them or we've removed them. We're a source of knowledge. So I delved into literature and read up a lot, and I've had a great opportunity to work with quite a few native folks over the years, and I'll share that. It's been a great delight, and I feel as I've learned a lot that now I'm in a place to not just share that information, but I've been directly involved in repatriating and matriating traditional plant knowledge. And that's led me to recently, I'm working with several tribes, the Osage, the Arikara, the Omaha, I've worked some with the Ho-Chunk too, and now a little bit more with the Dakota. So there's several tribal groups I've been able to work with and help them recapture, relearn, and continue to develop the knowledge that they have. So it's a mix of all those things. My research program at the University of Kansas has been broad, but I keep coming back to this topic of ethnobotany. Ethnobotany is really the cultural use of plant materials. And for me, I would say I'm a prairie ethnobotanist because prairies have been my focus and love. For that too, I'm helped found and part of a land trust, the Kansas Land Trust. We've protected over 30,000 acres of prairies and other habitats in Kansas through conservation easements. So it's great to come here and see a land trust doing similar work and talking about some of the same things, and then this ethnobotany link and cultural link is really quite heartwarming. So I see the intertwining of prairies and ethnobotany, plant use, and education. Teaching our kids about plant uses, helping the public to learn about the importance of our heritage and the knowledge and wisdom of people before us, and then of course of the plants themselves. So I'm going to share some of that. First, I always like to talk about where we're from, and as I said, I've been working with the Osage, and well, we're in Osage territory right here. Probably most of you don't even think about that. And then, of course, I'm going to tell you, well, that's not the only tribe whose lands we're on. There's an inset, a small inset showing one depiction of all the tribes who supposedly have territory here. Probably it's a depiction from, 1750 or a proposed idea at that time. The Osage ideas about being here earlier than that. And if we talk about who was here before, really the first question is, when are you talking about? Are you talking, 300 years ago? Are you talking 500? Are you talking 10,000? We've had native peoples here all that time. And I think those of us in the dominant culture now are just starting to recognize that, and whose land we're on, and the idea of land acknowledgement is important, and yet it's confusing. Native peoples didn't divide up territory like we do. They didn't have state boundaries or county boundaries. For the most part, land overlapped, and it wasn't owned, it was resources. There was fighting, but more often than fighting, there was sharing, and culture groups moved around, and groups grew stronger and weaker over time, and tribes ebbed and flowed and moved on to different resources. But all of that in hundreds, thousands of years, so long, long periods of time. So I've been part of a research program at the University of Kansas. We got a large multi-million-dollar grant to look at the medicinal constituents of native plants. And I was very fortunate to work with a very talented medicinal chemist in her lab, and I got to pick plants that we were going to work on. So of course I focused almost entirely on our native species, and we ended up testing over 200 species of plants for antioxidants, anti-cancer compounds, and anti-inflammatory compounds. So that work is, I'm going to share some of that because rather fascinating what we did. I mean, this combination of research teams to move this work forward. In looking, though, at the use of plants for medicine, one needs to talk about conservation. So in putting together a list of plants to study, you just need to avoid threatened and endangered species. You really don't want to make a discovery on plants that you're going to threaten more or have trouble obtaining. So we made sure we avoided that, and we tried to have a conservation ethic in the work that we did by harvesting plants in places where we could return or we did not overuse those resources. And then, as I talked about and touched on, need to have respect for indigenous knowledge of the plants themselves. And then ultimately, kind of what I see as ecological responsibility. For those things we started to make discovery on, we wanted to think about how those plants could be procured or grown so that there would be a supply. Native prairies are rich in their diversity. This is a picture of a prairie we protected in Kansas, the Aikens Prairie, which has over 240 plant species on it, or over 200 species on it, of which on this slide I say 140 species have been used for food. As I mentioned, I wrote that edible plants of the prairie guide back in 1985, 86. I've learned a lot since then. So the new edition I'm working on, which will be out, be over a year, be long yet. I now have over 200 species of prairie plants that were used as food. I've expanded the work by both what I've learned and I've been more inclusive. So things like wild onions, I've kind of gone through the list and realized that any species of wild onion was eaten as flavoring food. So I've included all of those. And then I've learned a lot more. So I've included more species in that work. And I have a wide definition of prairie species. So we think about what's, perhaps been planted in a restoration to what you might see on a native prairie. But I also want to point out, and I will talk about, many things that we might call weeds. Lamb's quarter, pigweeds, annual sunflower, all are prairie plants. I excluded non-native weeds that are annuals and others because I want to focus on prairies, but those are native weeds that have valuable food resources. And I also include shrubs in my list of prairie plants. Plums, chokecherries, things like that are really part of the prairie. Now in our management day, we want to use fires, we kind of want to keep out the woodies, and I understand that. But they are a part of our prairies and our natural prairies. So I take a wide view of what those plants and plant resources are. And of course, prairies are grasslands of the world, of North America, and you can see on this map that there's a large green blob west, and the biggest remaining portion of at least tallgrass prairie is in Kansas, the Flint Hills, but it's been rather degraded. And there's greater diversity of plants as you come northeast. And then, of course, everywhere you see the one picture of all the cropland everywhere, really. Prairies have been lost due to farmland conversion. So it's a threatened plant community, even though it's so large and huge. And what's really been threatened are the high-quality prairies, those that have our most beautiful and unusual wildflowers. There's many sources of information for ethnobotany. There's an ethnobotany database online, the Native American Ethnobotany database that's been put together over the years. My book's a resource. And then we're very much been focused on developing more information, so I'll explain. One of the key characters in kind of the history of ethnobotany in the Midwest, Great Plains, has been Melvin Gilmore. Melvin Gilmore grew up in Nebraska and
developed this interest in edible and medicinal plants and native peoples, and started in the 19-teens and through the 1920s, interviewing elders in many tribes, Lakota, Dakota, Omaha, Ponca, Winnebago, Osage, others, and compiled all of that information into a really wonderful book called Use of the Plants of the Upper Missouri River Region. But Gilmore, unfortunately, died sooner than he had finished publishing, and had many, many notes, and I've had great pleasure in delving into Gilmore's work. I joke about spending a lot of time in Gilmore-topia as I've gone to archives of his information at the University of Nebraska, the North Dakota State Historical Society, the University of Michigan, and especially at the Smithsonian. So I have copied and photographed lots and lots of his notes, and have found that there were many things that he did not publish or finish publishing, including an entire ethnobotany on the Riccara tribe, which we more recently published. And for that work and the work that I now do with tribes, I contacted and had two Riccara researchers join me in publishing that work, critiquing it and adding to it. And I believe that collaborative research is really the way we need to go. This is a copy of Gilmore's book, and if you're heavily into medicinal plants, Gilmore's important read, but a difficult read. Wrote at the Times, and it's all about a plant, and I won't say it's technical, but it's a little dense, but very, very useful and interesting. It's a picture of him with a Pawnee elder, and he got to know the Pawnee and went out to their sacred sites in Nebraska. And the Pawnee related to the Riccara, so when he went to the Riccara, he had an in because of his friend who was an elder and had given him a Pawnee name. So that name was known by the Riccara and helped him in his work. And Gilmore was an outdoorsman. I get amused at this picture, camping out in the snow, but like that. In his work with the Riccara, these are archival things I found at the Smithsonian. The woman in this picture is showing these young kids how traditional baskets were made. So she's cutting I believe it's, I can't remember in this case, but I think it's ash sticks for this. And even more amazing is Desticata. The woman here was in her 80s in 1926 when she was interviewed. And so she was a major source of information, and Gilmore was not fluent in Riccara, but had someone help him translate. And she shared many of the plant stories that he knew. And this is a picture of her. He took both photographs and some motion pictures of things at that time, and collected many goods, which are at the Smithsonian. Ears of corn, choke cherries, plums, all made into packs and patties to be stored for food. That's a tremendous record of information. Gilmore did something that good botanists know about. He even did collect voucher specimens. This is one of them, and this is bee balm that Gilmore collected, and he wrote on it too the Lakota name, Washima, and its use. So he was recording information that can be found with his collections. And I want to emphasize that one of the important things for botanists today is collecting plants. This is just a specimen I collected of buckeye, Ohio buckeye. And in collecting plants, they're your thing that provides proof. So if I write about Ohio buckeye, I can cite this collection, and then you can look at the collection and see what it says on it. And if you are skilled and have doubts and think it's a different species, or maybe it gets changed, maybe the species name's changed, this is the record to fall back on. So it's good to have voucher specimens, and they're important for the work of knowing about historical uses of plants. So again, we do database work, and so I database Gilmore's notes, and this is part of the materials that I'm working to return to various tribes, and help me keep track of that information as I use it. So back to our research project. So we went to many places to collect plants, many habitats of different sorts of prairies, canyons, out in western Kansas, national grasslands, national wildlife refuges, sources where we could get plant material. So for the chemists, what they really wanted to test is dried plant material. And they really like a lot of plant material. They wanted 2 dried kilograms of each plant we're going to collect. And you know, plants are mostly water. Usually like 80–90% water. So we had to collect 15 to 20 pounds of plant material, which in some cases is easy. I'll show you some of those. In other cases it was really hard, and we needed to make sure that it was dried, and we needed to make sure we didn't let it mold. Didn't want to have a discovery and then find out later it wasn't the plant that had that compound, but the mold. That would be embarrassing. So again, to do our work, we used GPS locations for accurate data. We collected our specimens. We collected our plant material. We had big data sheets that provided lots of information we thought might be useful in the future. So for each collection, we had location information, how to go back and get it, things about the plant. Of course, doing field work, sometimes it's hard to find a place to stay or a place to eat, especially as rural countryside is struggling, as we all know. Small towns aren't what they used to be, but they're hanging on. So this is a picture of us, like, this is what it looks like to try 20 pounds of many different species. We quickly learned that we should find good places to work that had storage areas that we could use. We made a mistake early in our work that we'd use motel rooms and go out for the day and turn fans on with, you know, these tarps with plants on, put them on the beds, come back. Staying at a motel out in southwest Kansas and came back several years ago. We had regular phones in every room. And, you know, the phone had its red light and it was flashing. And I picked it up, and it was the front desk. And we were one of these hotels that said, you know, American owned, but it was immigrants from India, right? And so the guy in his Indian accent said, pick up the phone. He said, I said, yeah, a message. He says, yeah, you can't do that here. You can't have those plants. That's not legal. So we had a green leafy plant material on the bed. It was not marijuana, but he didn't believe us. We kind of got kicked out. So I said, I'm going to buy this. This is not. So we learned we needed to use research places or barns or sheds where we could actually lay out plant material and not be bothered by it. We decided we didn't want to heat dry plants. We thought about getting a dryer, but to keep the maximum amount of compounds in the plant, we used air dryers, so mostly fans. Or when we got back to the lab, we have extensive fume hoods, which have passing air every 2 to 5 minutes, so that dries things out pretty fast. Buffalo gourd, which is a plant that does make it into Illinois, like on railroad tracks, waste ground, but it's a native plant throughout the plains. We liked it for our collection because it's one of those big rooted species. So, you know, something like this, if you're trying to get your weight in plants, it's not hard to get something heavy. The root was used. Just a tremendous big root, which has edible carbohydrates in the root. So you can imagine it's a pretty big food source traditionally. But it's also very, very bitter, so it needs to be bleached and prepared. But even the big root's a problem for us because the chemists want small particles, and you can't just hand them a big root. So we had to cut it up, dry it, put it in a bandsaw, then we could put it through our grinder. So it was quite a big deal. I'll also talk a little about some of the plants we work with. This is boneset, and boneset's a great story as a medicinal plant. And of course, you think, oh, I know what that's used for. But what it really is used for is the big pandemic in 1918, that the huge flu, actually, you know, probably originated in Kansas, if you read about this. And Some soldiers who were staying at Fort Riley helped spread it around the world. Is that we were in the middle of World War I, and so went from a farm to Fort Riley in Kansas, and then they were shipped out to Europe to fight World War I and to spread the pandemic globally. At least a couple million people died from that horrible flu, and it's a flu in some ways similar to some of the flus we've had, where like your bones would ache, right? It'd be just achy, right? Well, Boneset helped get over that. Boneset helped alleviate what was called the bone break fever. And Boneset has immune stimulating compounds in it. And so they actually were herbalists and doctors at that time who used a lot of herbal products were recommending Boneset. And people got over their symptoms of that fever, at least in some cases. Other plants' names are more confusing or don't mean as much, but the big lobelia we have around here, the big lobelia, is Lobelia syphilitica. Well, it was used to treat syphilis, but it does not appear to be very effective. That use has pretty well disappeared, but the name has stayed with the plant. Other things we've collected, something that's really odd out in the prairies is this daughter, Cuscuta, which is a parasite. And it does not make its own photosynthesis. It's the orange stuff in that picture. And it is species or a group of species specific. So there's like one that likes sunflowers. And there's some that like other species of plant, like legumes. And they get all their nourishment off those plants. Of course, they have to find that plant within a few days of germinating, or they'll die. Because they only live off other plants. Well, this plant exchanges bodily fluids with other species, which we know is dangerous. And there's some research that shows this plant has a lot of antibiotics in it. So we thought, oh, this would be a good one for us to look at, you know? But it's these threads. And these threads are like string. They don't weigh anything. So it took us a really, really long time to collect enough and dry it. And in telling you some of our results, it didn't have anything of value to us, right? That's what science is, right? Work and discovery. Had a lot of opportunity to work in Colorado, and these little blanket rolls are a way we bring back plants that aren't quite dried, and roll them up this jelly roll, and bring them back to our lab where we can try them. This is what a lab looks like, sometimes drying plants in it, just spread all over the place. But as I said, we collected over 200 species of plants, and as they were processing them here, those bags are back and dried. That grinder is Wapello mill. One of the things difficult about doing science is equipment's expensive. That's a $20,000 grinder. It's just a blender on steroids. But using a tool like that too, we have to be very careful to clean it. So many of our plants are really sticky. So like if you grind up goldenrod or asters, there's a lot of resinous material on those. And it would stick inside the grinder. We had to remove that, clean the grinder thoroughly, because again, we don't want a discovery of some plant to be really leftover material from some other plant. So we had to go quite a few lengths to do that. And this is how our material looked. This is the Gara. That's 2 kilograms of ground plant material the chemists would use. You can see bags and bags of plant material. So coming forward, all of our plants, mostly all prairie plants that we looked at, the leading candidate for both antioxidants and anti-cancer was what I now call the wild tomatillo, or something you might know as the ground cherry. Another weedy prairie plant, you know, if you started asking people what's your favorite prairie plant, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who would say, hey, that wild tomatillo, that's what I like best, but you should. Of the 200 species of plants we tested, the first clue we had that this was an important plant was it was the highest in antioxidants. Antioxidants are, we know those as like vitamin C, and they're very helpful to us. And they also are related to dealing with inflammation and are also viewed very positively as being anti-cancer. So this project we're working on, we also involved our medical center, and they said, you know, we'd like to try that one and see how that works in our anti-cancer screens. And it scored exceptionally high in the anti-cancer screen, so they're pretty excited about it. The chemists at KU started working on it more and extracted compounds, and finally came up with it was a series of compounds that were creating that activity. And as they were getting those extracted, the folks at the medical center were doing other tests, including, you know, there's always tests on animals which I'm not entirely comfortable with, but they had rats that had tumors, and by giving them this compound from this plant, they actually reduced in size. So we were very excited about that. The chemists had realized that this was an important compound, so we submitted that to publication and said it has this efficacy with cancer. It looks promising. And I didn't know this before I started with chemists, but new discovery, you're the ones who get to name the compounds. So my colleagues named these compounds Jayhawkins in reflection of we were the Kansas Jayhawks. The paper was accepted, but the editor said, "What's this Jayhawkins stuff?" So I was looking at the school's mascot, which is actually an anti-slavery mascot, you know, it's kind of a good thing. So these compounds are now called withanolides, which relates to, they're also related compounds in another plant called withania. It's a much less interesting name. The work continued on this, and come to find out that the berry, actually a fruit within that husk tomato, the tomatillo, also had these compounds. And I had requested we look at that because they've been used extensively as food. In fact, they're very tasty, if they're ripe. So when I wrote my first book, I was pleased to say that I've actually tried all the plants that I've written about. And so I tasted these wild tomatillos and thought they were okay, but not really very good. And I didn't write that in the book. I didn't say these are okay. You know, it's kind of like you're positive on what your work is. So, you know, before they're edible. This research project, though, made me realize I was eating green fruit. So we collected a whole bunch of these fruits because we were testing them and we were curing out, and so we ended up growing big plots of them and harvesting the fruits and wanting to try, because the chemists didn't have to use dried fruit. So I had hundreds, maybe thousands of these fruits just laying out, and they didn't dry. After a whole month, those fruits just sat there. They didn't mold, they didn't rot, they didn't dry. So we realized we should cut them in half. But I also noticed that just a few of them were getting yellow. I tasted them and was like, oh, these are sweet, these are good. Be a little bit like, you know, if you didn't know anything about tomatoes, you know, the first time you grew them, got some nice big green tomatoes, and you thought, oh, good, I like what I can eat. And you'd bite into a green tomato and go, these aren't very good. But if they're ripe, same thing. These are related closely to our tomatoes, actually, in the same family, nightshade family. So the ripe fruits have a long history of food use. Just delve into a little bit of it. The green is the range of wild tomatillos. The red dots are just a few of the archaeological sites where the seeds of wild tomatillos show up, and there's some numbers related to tribes in which we have documentation that they actually ate these as food. And now I've delved in more, there's probably hundreds of archaeological sites where these would be found or in the remains. Green sauce goes way back. People made tomatillo sauce way back. The hot pepper part of it's more recent, but going way back, it's been a flavorful tomatoes and sauce. I mean, green tomato sauce, you look at it that way. And it's used in, you know, over food, you know, if you had a dish of corn or something, corn and beans, mixed with squash, you just put this nice sauce over the top. Or if you're making a bison stew and wanted to take it and get a little different flavor, you'd add some of this sauce. So they would harvest large numbers of these. They would mash them into packs, like fat pancakes, and dry them. And those are reported in a lot of the old historical literature as the food. And then archaeological sites, you know, there's a long history of burning food. Who here has burnt food, right? And people, you know, cooked over open fires. They burn food even more, right? Burnt food makes burnt seeds. If you carbonize seeds, they will last for eons, practically, or at least centuries. So it's very hard to get archaeological food remains here in the Midwest, Great Plains, because things rot. We have really good decomposition. So it's hard to find things, but if things are carbonized, they show up. So many archaeological sites, you find this as food. So we had this food, and then the good thing with that is it made me realize, wow, this is a healthful thing, full of antioxidants. Native people's eating tremendous amounts of this. That's probably one of the reasons they were so healthy, is that they were eating these wild foods that offered this greater health. The story on the anti-cancer became a little disappointing on a couple levels. The anti-cancer reduction tumor part didn't last. The tumors grew again. The chemists tried a bunch of other formulations of that. You can attach little OH rings on the outside. You can mess and tweak the chemistry. Sometimes you can make it more absorbable by the body. None of that quite seemed to work. Discoveries still look promising. Very expensive research. We couldn't get additional funding for it, and it wasn't promising enough for a pharmaceutical firm to take interest. So still kind of out there as some potential, but it didn't quite happen. So that's the tomatillo story. Other plants, wild roses, we saw some today out in the prairie. A food source, all rose petals are edible. And of course, rose hips have a long history of being used as food. Not always desirable, the seeds and... I did that. Sorry. Indian grass. Rose hips are used as a food. Not a favorite food always, but also as a flavoring. And the inner bark of roses. Okay, the inner bark of roseberries is Irish. Traditional people had lots of problems being around fires. Eyes were tired and sore, the smokiness, of being around fire. So, long history of that. Mentioned plums. Plums are a long-term food source. Of course, the smell of the flowers in spring is wonderful, and fruits laid down on bushes. Used extensively, used in pemmican at times, which is dried fruit, dried pounded meat, fat, put together as a good food source. Bee balm. Bee balm is a wonderful plant, smells great, mint. Long history of its use, primarily for like rough throats, sore throats. Still use that way. If you have a really tough sore throat, drink some bee balm tea. It'll definitely soothe it. This plant was known by many tribes, and several of them had many names for the plant because it had different smells and tastes, which are used to separate it into different varieties or species. Still an important plant, Potawatomi. This picture we did some work up in the Potawatomi Reservation, and Verna Cox in the center was delighted we could pick bee balm for her. On the dry side of things, prickly pears. Edible fruits, edible tags. Of course, the problematic part is the spines. A lot of what we need to do or think about is, well, how do you fuel these things? Well, you can easily remove the spines by burning them off. Just holding the fruits or little tongs, and then those little spines, the small ones, just melt in the heat. Then they become good fruits to eat with big seeds, duck seeds. Another plant that probably is here in this part of Illinois, it's up in the Driftless area of Wisconsin. So it's probably over prairies here too. Is a prairie turtle, which you can't even hardly see in that picture, but it's the form with the spreading leaves. and it's known more for its big root, really a nice starchy bean family root. Prairie turnip, I like calling it tipsum, which is a derivation of the Lakota name for the plant or root. This was the most widely used food across Great Plains, Midwest Indians. All tribes used it, where they could find it, would dig up these roots. They were dried, they were used much like we might think of potatoes or white rice used. In fact, the Dakota name for the plant essentially translates as the little wild rice of the prairie. So it's just like wild rice as a starchy, grain-like food. They would grind it up and use it as a potato or rice, and add it to soups or stews. Use it in any number of ways. It was so important that summer bison hunts by Plains tribes where they would go to hunt bison was where the women would be able to gather prairie turnips and choke cherries. They would camp there, and the men would go out from there and hunt bison. They'd dry the prairie turnips, choke cherries, and then dry the meat, and come back to the villages. Been a pleasure to work with many Native peoples, and I also like to honor Haskell Indian Nations University of Lawrence. I've had many students from this pan-tribal school in Lawrence, one of the two federally pan-tribal schools in the U.S., which is in Lawrence, so we get a chance to work with them a lot. Let's skip forward a slide. This is up on the Lakota Reservation. We said I've done work up there, and they still harvest prairie turnips. One thing I want to say is that the traditional use of plants, much of what I talk about is historic, because I look at a lot of historic documents. But these traditions are still alive. People are still using prairie turnips. Even though we don't know about them as a culture, these are still an important food source for Native peoples. Picture of Alma Snell up on the Crow Reservation. She did a book called The Taste of Heritage, which is her cookbook. Little recipes of edible medicinal plants. I got to know Alma and wrote the preface for her book. It was a great delight in working with her, and one of the difficulties we have in ethnobotany circles is we're likely to know what plant was used for what. And we have very few recipes. So when things were cooked, we don't know how they were cooked. Or even worse, with medicines, we don't even know how they were prepared. Often we don't even know whether there's a root or the top or what part was used. Rather frustrating. This is prairie fawn lily, erythroniums, relative of trout lilies or dogtooth violets. This one occurs a little bit here in Illinois, mainly further west. But these bulbs were pit-baked. There are a lot of things that were pit-baked. We talked about being wild camas, Camassia, out in the Wapello prairie, was another root that would be pit-baked. And pit-baking was essentially building a big fire, heating rocks really hot, putting in some green leaves, and then putting in your bulbs to roast. Covering it up with both leaves, more hot rocks, covering the whole thing with dirt, and this oven was allowed to bake for like 3 days. And then you'd uncover it, and the bulbs would be soft and sweet. The slow cooking, pit baking converts more of the carbohydrates into sugars, so made for really sweet roots. And a lot of plants are used that way. We don't have really good records of that. A lot of starchy roots were baked. Well, echinacea is my favorite wildflower. This is Echinacea angustifolia further west, which is the leading wild plant used as medicine by Native Americans. But all the echinaceas were important medicine to Native peoples, really throughout the whole eastern United States. This western species grows in very dry, rocky habitats, but the Echinacea pallida, which is found here, is much more widespread. All of them were not only important to Native Americans, but are important herbal products today. Been a long history of harvesting snake-rooted pictures from the 1950s. Even last year, just pre-pandemic, I ran across a root buyer in Kansas, bought roots first. So there's this long history of people harvesting roots, echinacea roots, selling medicinal plant trade, but there's been concern about the millions of plants that have been harvested, what that might affect populations. I believe in working with traditional people, and traditional people are those out there harvesting roots, whether they're Native Americans or Americans who've been around only a century. So we went out with diggers of these roots and found out how they worked, and they started telling us, you know, we can go back these patches about every 3 years. We've been harvesting roots in my family for 80 years, and it just keeps coming back. Well, I thought at first, well, you just don't see all the plants, and there's little ones, and so we're probably just missing quite a few of them. The guy said, no, it re-sprouts. I was kind of skeptical. So we went out with him more and found out that the roots did re-sprout. We found out that about 50% of the plants that were dug re-sprouted. So echinacea has a tremendous ability to do that. In fact, if you think about plants in your yard, there's hardly any plants in your yard that you dig down cut them off 6 to 8 inches below ground, and they'd come back. I can kill almost everything in our yards. Even our native plants. They'll come back from 3 or 4 inches, but not quite that deep. So rather remarkable. So we felt the conservation side is pretty well taken care of. And there's been very good work on echinaceas. One of the clinical trials, randomized tests. I like this one a lot. This is about air travelers that fly long distance to or from Australia. And, if you're flying long distance, you're at risk, right, for the guy next to you that's hacking away, right? I mean, they're just in that enclosed space. So they did a study of 2 groups. The group that did consume an echinacea tincture, that's water and alcohol extract made by an Australian company. They consumed that before, during, and after their long-distance flights. They were statistically less likely to get the upper respiratory tract infections, and if they did, the amount of time that they had it was statistically less. So proving that indeed with echinacea there's some efficacy in the traditional practices. So in sharing this, I'm kind of wrapping up here. I just want to make the point that there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that natives have about our native plants for food and medicine. A lot of that knowledge is still with native people. There's a lot we still can learn today about what they do. There's still a lot of historical records. There's kind of a renaissance of desire to learn and even share traditional knowledge by native people. And now many of us are recognizing the value of that, which is really a great thing. And I really commend people here as you're thinking forward about culture and nature and your center that you're going to build and trying to make that appropriate in all these different ways. It's really, really significant. So I've had a great pleasure in doing gardens. I want to talk about a little bit of education and gardening and signage. We have a research garden at the university that's where we've grown out a lot of our plants, especially when we were trying to maximize the production and realize in some cases it was easier to grow 20 pounds of live material than collect it, or for things that we had success with, we needed to grow more of them. One of the things I've shown you is that with many of our native plants, which are really, really tough, it's really surprising how easily they get disease or insects when you grow them together. So part of what nature's about is diversity. It's a very important thing. If you crowd things together, it's not surprising that you have more pests or diseases. So we have a research garden, and my colleagues in the School of Pharmacy and Medicinal Chemistry have a very nice building. We're involved in helping create the garden for them. So the School of Pharmacy has a medicinal plant garden. And I'm also pleased to say that this past year, the University of Iowa installed a medicinal plant garden at its School of Pharmacy. Actually, it's a long tradition. This picture on the lower left is our cave drug garden from the 1940s. So there was a history of this idea of growing plants, and we tried to replicate the plants in the drug garden that was originally at KU in the little garden that we're doing now at the university. We had to skip a couple things. We decided we would not grow the opium poppies or the marijuana. Both are semi-illegal, and Kansas marijuana is definitely illegal. I don't know where they disappear in the middle of the night rather than legal this year. But we've also focused a lot on signage, and I find that signage is a really important way to reach people. So in our gardens we have a large series of small font signs. Of course, there's the actination sign. In that, especially the School of Pharmacy, we list when it was in the National Formulary or U.S. Pharmacopoeia, because those at one time were really kind of the guiding light of pharmacists. And then we've also tried to list Native American uses to make sure that's part of what we've done about these plants. I skipped a slide, but this slide will next show the KU drug garden, and this one shows the original garden with the big patch of marijuana in the back, which was considered a good research topic at the time. I'm not the biggest proponent of marijuana, but it really does need some research and discovery. It's kind of embarrassing as a scientist that it's been a taboo topic. Finally, we do chores too, and if you ever find yourself coming to Kansas in late spring or up in the fall, we kind of postponed doing these tours during COVID, but we very much enjoy doing these garden tours. And lastly, I'm going to put up my website and tell you we have information online too, which you're welcome to look at. And I would very much enjoy taking some questions, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly. No pun intended, or maybe pun intended, a lot to digest here. But, I did want to end with one story that's related to what Kelly has been sharing, and that is work with indigenous communities. Today is a day that's being reclaimed by many communities as Indigenous Peoples Day, reclaiming it from Columbus Day. And one of the ways we wanted to be thinking about that was bringing Kelly here to talk about the work he's been doing with tribal communities and with plants that we have in our preserves. So thank you for weaving those two ideas together so nicely for us, the science side and the cultural side. This is where I see our work going in a lot of ways. Last evening, Tom Clay, one of our staff members, and I had the opportunity to meet with Sap and Fox and Meskwaki elders at our Casper Bluff Land and Water Reserve. We met with two members of, we met with the elder of the fish clan of the Meskwaki, who is cousins with the elder of the fish clan of the Sac and Fox. So two closely related groups, Sac and Fox of Oklahoma, and the Meskwaki tribe in Tama, Iowa, about 2.5 hours west of us. We also met with the elder of the Fox clan of the Sac and Fox, as well as with their tribal historic preservation officer. And we started, it was interesting, and just sort of by happenstance that I was trying to think about how do I reintroduce these people who were native to this land. None of them, of the 5 men who were there, none of them had been back to their ancestral lands in Northwest Illinois. So just think about that statement for a while. They lived on this land for hundreds of years. They consider this one of their ancestral homelands. And they had never stepped foot here. So how do we welcome them back? So just so happened, I picked some bergamot, some bee balm, and some wild mountain mint is what I call it. What's the scientific name? Pycnanthemum. And put them in a little glass, like a little bouquet, and I welcomed them back to their ancestral homeland, and I said, I want to reintroduce you to a smell that maybe your ancestors knew well, walking through the prairies this time of year or any time in the summer. Those of you who have walked through a native prairie in the summer, you know that smell when you step on one of those plants. And I've done this a lot with people, but I've never had this experience. Most people are kind of shy about smelling things, and these guys, all 5 of them, grabbed it and just. And 2 of them said, I know this plant. My grandmother used it to heal me when I had stomach aches. And I thought, wow, that was a powerful connection for them to this place. And it was also sad to me that they've been disconnected from this place for hundreds of years and disconnected from that plant. They're now in Oklahoma. And we went on to have a really interesting set of conversations, and I'll boil it down to this. They thanked me for reintroducing them to their homeland. And I just found that really odd. But they were sincere about it. And then a group of people arrived, just people coming up to see Casper Bluff. And it was incredible to watch them, these 5 men, complete strangers, welcome this group of strangers to their homeland. It was that instant for them. And, I just get shivers thinking about it. But that's the work you're doing with us. That's the work that's ahead of us. And Kelly, I just want to thank you for helping set that stage for us and encouraging us to continue this journey with tribal partners that trace their heritage to this place. And I love the idea of having a medicinal and food garden with traditional names and maybe traditional recipes, traditional cures. That's all coming, right? We can see it coming. So I invite you to join us on this journey. There'll be more of these kinds of events and speakers coming our way over the next couple of years. And thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this community. And think tonight as you're leaving about the indigenous people of this place and how we can welcome them back. Thank you very much.